In the shadow of a legend, a new warrior rose. The son of Ragnar, yet destined to carve his own path. Bjorn Ironside, fierce in battle, unshaken by storm, and remembered as more than just a name. This is the saga of the Viking who defied fate, and etched his legend into the heart of history. The sea was alive with fury. Black clouds rolled across the sky like war banners unfurled by angry gods, and the thunder crashed as if Thor himself were striking the heavens. Below, fragile longships creaked and groaned, tossed like driftwood by the merciless waves. Men shouted, clinging to oars slick with rain, their breath torn away by the howling wind. In the heart of this chaos, one figure stood upright, gripping the mast with hands cut raw by the ropes. His hair was soaked, his eyes alight with fire. This was Bjorn, son of Ragnar Lothbrok. The sagas would say he was born of storms, that no blade could pierce his skin. They would call him Ironside. But in this moment he was only a young man fighting not to drown. The Viking age was an age of hunger and ambition. The North had little to give. Winters that bit into bone, soil that yielded only grudgingly, and kingdoms forever at war with one another. To survive, the Norse had learned to take. They carved ships sleek and fast, sails dyed crimson with blood and defiance. They crossed oceans the rest of the world feared to touch, guided only by stars and instinct. And in the midst of this restless tide of men stood Ragnar Lothbrok, raider, trickster, king, legend. Every hall from England to Francia knew his name. Every child heard whispers of his conquests, and that was the shadow Bjorn was born into. To the world, he was Ragnar's son, a branch on a great oak. But Bjorn was not content to live in shade. He wanted light. He wanted to burn as brightly as his father, perhaps brighter still. Yet every step he took, every raid he joined, the murmurs followed, "There is Ragnar's boy. He fights well, but he is no Ragnar." The weight of expectation pressed like an iron collar around his throat. The first blood he spilled was not his father's, nor his enemies', but his own. On his first raid, his sword shook in his hand as they crashed upon a Saxon village. Fires raged, screams split the air, and steel clashed in the narrow lanes between wooden huts. Bjorn swung and missed, stumbled, and a farmer's axe slashed his arm open. He felt the sting of mortal pain, the hot rush of blood. But he did not fall. Rage surged in him, not for conquest, not for Ragnar, but for himself. He struck back, harder than before, cutting the man down in a single brutal stroke. His arm bled, yet he fought on. Later, the men said they saw him stand against 5, his skin unbroken, his flesh like iron. Thus was the seed of his legend planted. Yet the truth was simpler, grimmer. He had bled, but he had refused to stop. The raids multiplied. Villages fell to flame, their treasures loaded onto longships that skimmed across waves like blades. Bjorn's eyes grew sharp with experience, his arms thick with the weight of war. Still, the shadow of Ragnar loomed. In every hall, when skalds sang of victories, Ragnar's name rang louder. Bjorn's was an echo. And in the quiet of night, by dying campfires, Bjorn would stare into the embers and ask himself, was he born to follow or to lead? It was during these restless nights that a figure entered his story. Some say he was a seer, cloaked in raven feathers, his eyes clouded with prophecy. Others claim he was a grizzled warrior, scarred and silent, who had seen more seas than any man alive. The sagas never name him clearly, but they agree he came to Bjorn when the boy was becoming a man. Their first meeting was cold as steel. The stranger offered guidance, maps of stars, whispers of lands far beyond. Bjorn scoffed. Why should he trust this man? Yet the stranger answered with only one sentence. Do you want to be Ragnar's shadow or your own flame? From that night, the ally remained at his side. Not a friend yet, nor an enemy, but a presence. They spoke little, but when storms threatened, it was this man who pointed to hidden coves. When hunger gnawed, it was this man who found berries in thickets and fish in rivers. Slowly, suspicion turned to reliance, and reliance to something like trust. Bjorn's trials sharpened. On the coast of Francia, they faced warriors clad in chainmail, shields locked tight, swords flashing in the sun. The battle was brutal. The Franks held firm, their lines unbreaking. Bjorn charged again and again, fury spilling from his lungs, until finally he broke through. He remembered the heat of it, the clash of shield, the bite of steel, the roar of men dying. He remembered too the silence afterward, the smell of blood mingling with sea salt. His body bore wounds, yet the Franks whispered afterward, their leader cannot be harmed. Blades slide from him like rain. The myth grew. The skalds sang of a warrior invulnerable, a man touched by gods. Mothers hushed their children with tales of Ironside, who walked through fire unscathed. But the truth lingered in the quiet moments. Bjorn alone knew how deep his cuts went, how many nights he pressed cloth to wounds and prayed they would not fester. The gods had not blessed him with steel skin. His blessing was endurance. He felt pain, he simply did not yield to it. Still, it was not enough. No matter how many raids, no matter how many victories, Ragnar's shadow stretched across the horizon. Bjorn's name was known, but never alone. Always tethered. And so, one night beneath the northern lights, with the smell of pine thick in the air, Bjorn stood before his men. His ally beside him, silent as ever. The young warrior's voice rang out against the cold, "I am not my father. My path is not his. Beyond these seas lie empires greater than any we have touched. Gold beyond measure. Cities of marble and stone. And I will see them. I will take them. I will make my name." The men listened. Some laughed, calling him mad. Others whispered in awe. His ally simply nodded, as though he had expected nothing less. At dawn, the ships were readied. Their prows faced south, toward waters few Norse had dared. The Mediterranean, a place of emperors and deserts, where tales spoke of serpents in the sea and cities that shone brighter than the sun. The sky darkened as sails unfurled. Waves struck the hulls like drumbeats of destiny. Bjorn's heart thundered in his chest. The sagas would later say he vanished into storms, his ships swallowed whole, only to reappear in distant lands like a phantom. Others whispered that Odin himself guided his sails, that the Norns had woven his fate into something eternal. But in truth, it was only men in wooden ships setting out into the unknown. Men driven by hunger, by fear, by ambition. And one among them, a son of Ragnar, driven by the burning need to no longer be a shadow. As the longships disappeared into the storm clouds, the sea swallowed their silhouettes. All that remained was the whisper of waves and the promise of a legend still to be written. Sea stretched endlessly, a vast desert of water shimmering under the sun. Days bled into nights, nights into days, with only the horizon to measure time. The longships rowed forward, each pull of the oars heavy with exhaustion. Salt crusted the men's lips, hunger gnawed at their bellies, and thirst burned in their throats. The northern winds had carried them far, but now the southern sun scorched them without mercy. Bjorn sat at the prow, his hair matted with sweat, his eyes scanning the endless blue. He had led them here, southward, toward lands of promise. Yet promise was a cruel mistress, and she offered them nothing but suffering. Around him, men collapsed, some whispering prayers to Odin, others cursing him for abandoning them in this wasteland of waves. One night, under a sky littered with strange unfamiliar stars, a storm struck. Black clouds swelled without warning, winds screaming like wolves. Waves rose higher than mountains, smashing against the ships. Men clung to the oars, their muscles breaking, their screams swallowed by thunder. Bjorn shouted above the chaos, his voice a raw command, forcing the men to row, to fight, to survive. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating faces twisted with terror. The sagas would later say the gods guided them through the storm, protecting their ships while foreign fleets were shattered. They would speak of Bjorn's divine blessing, how he stood unshaken while the heavens raged. Yet the truth was uglier. The storm stole ships, dragged men screaming into the black depths. Their sails ripped, their hulls cracked. Bjorn himself tied his own arm to the mast to keep from being hurled into the sea. He bled, he wept, he cursed the gods as fiercely as his men did. Survival was not a gift. It was clawed from death's hands. When the sun rose again, fewer ships floated on the calm. The men who remained were gaunt, hollow-eyed. But they were alive. And with survival came resolve. Land appeared at last, jagged cliffs, white sands, and strange forests unlike the pine and fir of the north. The men stumbled ashore, kissing the earth, weeping as they drank from fresh streams. Bjorn stood apart, staring inland. This was no mere raid, no simple plunder. This was discovery. Beyond those hills lay kingdoms untouched by the north, treasures waiting to be claimed. The first raids were swift and merciless. Villages fell to flame. The Mediterranean coast, Sicily, Spain, names the Norse tongue struggled to pronounce, burned under their axes. Close-up battles flared, steel against bronze, the cries of defenders cut short, the smoke rising into foreign skies. Bjorn's men plundered gold, silk, and spices unseen in the north. But even amidst the fire, Bjorn noticed the difference. These were not helpless farmers like in Saxon lands. These people fought with discipline, their walls high, their armor gleaming. One battle etched itself into memory. They descended upon a fortified town by dawn. The defenders stood tall in polished armor, shields gleaming like mirrors. Arrows rained upon the Vikings, cutting men down before they reached the gates. Bjorn led the charge, shield raised, the sun striking sparks from his blade. His roar carried above the clash of arms. The sagas would later claim the gates fell at his touch, that his fury alone broke their walls. In truth, the battle dragged for hours. Men clawed at the gates with bare hands, axes splintering on iron-bound wood. Fire was their ally. They set the gates aflame, smoke choking both friend and foe. When the gates collapsed, it was not the work of gods but of desperation and brute force. Bjorn entered the city bloodied, coughing, his lungs burning. But he entered victorious. In the aftermath, Bjorn walked among the corpses. He looked upon women clutching children, men dying in the mud. He was a Viking, a raider, but even he felt the weight of it. He ordered some spared. The men grumbled, thirsty for blood, but obeyed. Perhaps, in that moment, the legend of Ironside cracked a little, revealing not invulnerability but humanity. Through it all, the shadowy ally remained. He was no skald, no seer. But his words carried weight. At night, as they sat by the fire, he spoke quietly, "Do you see it now, Bjorn? The sagas will not remember the hunger, nor the storms, nor the corpses we leave behind. They will remember only your victories. And they will twist them until the man is lost in the myth." Bjorn stared into the flames, silent. He wanted the myth, and yet he felt the truth's sting. But glory is never without price. In Sicily, betrayal struck. Allied mercenaries turned their blades upon the Vikings, their promises of support revealed as traps. The Vikings found themselves surrounded, cut off from the sea. The clash was thunderous, arrows darkened the sky, swords rang on shields. Bjorn fought with desperation, blood running down his arms, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. His allies stood at his side, cutting down foes with ruthless efficiency. The sagas later declared that Bjorn could not be harmed, that he walked untouched through volleys of arrows, that spears splintered against his chest. But witnesses would tell another story. Bjorn's shield shattered, his flesh torn, his survival hanging by threads of chance and ferocity. Ships burned on the horizon, their sails collapsing into flame. Men screamed, some fleeing into forests, others fighting to their last breath. Bjorn survived, but he carried the memory with him like a scar. He had seen how fragile life truly was, how quickly glory turned to ash. When at last he returned to his ships, fewer in number, more battered than before, he looked to the horizon not with arrogance, but with grim determination. He had sought to step out of Ragnar's shadow, to carve a new world in fire and steel. He had tasted triumph, but also betrayal, hunger, and despair. The sagas would one day tell of Bjorn Ironside, who conquered the south, who was untouchable, who returned laden with wealth. But beneath the songs, the truth remained. He was no god, no immortal. He was a man who endured storms, starvation, and steel and refused to yield. And that refusal, that iron will, was perhaps the truest reason they called him Ironside. As Bjorn Ironside's voyages stretched across the seas, his name became a whisper of dread in the halls of kings and rulers. To the Franks, the English, and even the distant shores of the Mediterranean, he was not merely a Viking. He was a storm, a shadow that struck without warning and vanished into the waves. Yet the higher a man's legend rises, the more enemies it gathers. The years weighed on him. Kingdoms fortified their walls, fleets grew stronger, and alliances were forged to resist the endless raids. Bjorn was no longer the daring young warrior at his father's side, but a seasoned leader bearing scars of countless battles. Still, his spirit burned unbroken. He believed that true death comes not with the fall of the body, but with the silence of one's story. The chronicles tell of a great battle where Bjorn was struck down and thought dead. His enemies carried his lifeless body into the heart of their city, eager to display the fallen Viking as a trophy. But the tale takes a legendary turn. Inside his coffin, Bjorn stirred. Wounded but not defeated, he rose with his sword in hand and delivered a final, fearsome strike that sent terror rippling through his captors. Whether this moment was truth or myth hardly matters, for it sealed his place among the immortals. Bjorn Ironside did not simply live as a warrior. He became a legend that sailed beyond the horizon of history. His name, carried on the winds of the north, remains etched in the saga of the Vikings, forever a son of Ragnar, forever a storm upon the seas.